If you followed my Middle-earth map tour series, you'll know that I have called many places underrated, whether it's because they're mysterious, have a long, interesting history, or because they played an important, yet not overly renowned role in the grand tapestry of Middle-earth. But if I'm speaking about entire regions, so not just a single place or geographical feature, then I think there's one place that is more underrated than all of the rest. This is an area with a diverse population, a diverse history, and it served almost as a crossroad of different kingdoms and peoples. This is the complete tale of the Vales of Anduin. And if you haven't seen any of my other podcast type videos, I would like to make a disclaimer. This is the type of video that you can treat as a podcast. There will be visuals, but it's not necessary to watch the video. You can instead listen to it, perhaps while you work, or work out, or play games, or while you're cooking, or while you're commuting, or while you're digging suspicious holes in your backyard that are definitely not body-shaped. Anyway, here we go. I hope you enjoy the ride. Before we begin talking about the long history of the Vales of Anduin, first we need to talk about where the Vales of Anduin actually are. At some point, Tolkien used the Vales of Anduin, or the Anduin Vales, to describe all of the lands that ran alongside the Anduin, the Great River, which started in the Grey Mountains and emptied out into the sea at Gondor, or even just the southern parts around Gondor, specifically Ithilien and Anorion. However, the Vales of Anduin most commonly referred to and is most commonly recognised as the Northern Vales of Anduin. These are the lands flanked by the Misty Mountains in the west and Mirkwood in the east, from the foothills of the Grey Mountains in the north to Rathlorn and the southern reaches of Mirkwood in the south. And just as a disclaimer, I'm not really going to be talking about the full histories of Rathlorn or Mirkwood in this video. I will talk about them when they interact with the rest of the Vales of Anduin, or if there's rather important information, but despite being within or adjacent to the region, they were more or less separate entities that have their own long histories that are deserving of a more focused storytelling. That being said, the history of the Vales of Anduin actually begins with the elves because it was the location of the little-known second elven homeland, Atjamar, which literally translates to second home. This took place during the Great Journey when the Eldar travelled from Cuiviénen to Valinor. After braving the perils of the forest that would later be known as Mirkwood, the elven host, numbering around 22,000 strong, reached the Vales of Anduin. They were immediately enamoured with the place, describing it as being rich in flowers and food, and even going far as suggesting that they could dwell there permanently between wood and water, and that the Valar could guard them there. The only elves who were against this were the three elven chiefs, Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë, who had been to Valinor, but not even they could convince their people to leave. The timeline might not be exactly accurate, as Tolkien never completed it, but the elves seem to have dwelt in Atjamar, the eastern side of the Vales of Anduin, for a little over 60 years. However, Atjamar's pleasantness came to an abrupt end. There's a number of possible reasons for this. One was that it was simply due to natural causes. Another is that it was due to the machinations of Sauron, who may have already been messing with the Elven March. And the other possibility is that it was due to Orome withdrawing his protection, in an effort to get the elves to stop dawdling. Whatever the cause, the winters became harsher, snowstorms would come down from the imposing Misty Mountains, and the rains would cause the Anduin to flood. In the end, the elves decided to abandon Atjamar, but not all wished to leave. At this point, the Eldar number 28,000, but 3,000 of the Teleri, who were either afraid of the Misty Mountains or simply loved their new land dearly, decided to remain behind, and they would become known as the Nandor. These elves, led by Lenwë, also known as Dan, remain in the land they call Atjamar, inhabiting the forests that at this point cover most of the Vales of Anduin. For example, we're told that Greenwood extended further south at this point, and may have been connected to Lorinand, with only the river separating them. We also know that Lothlorien, Lorinand as it was known at the time, was connected to Fangorn at one point. The history of the Nandor is little known after this. For around 2,000 years they grew in number, but we know that not all was necessarily well. Morgoth's creatures, still being commanded by Sauron, would harass the weaker lands that could be found east of the Blue Mountains. And as a result, a group of Nandor, led by Denethor, the son of Lenwë, marched westward to seek the protection of King Thingol of Doriath, and ended up settling in Osiriand. As for Lenwë, he is never mentioned again, suggesting that he was either killed at some point during the First Age. But by the time the sun and moon arose, the circumstances had reversed. Morgoth, having returned to Middle-earth, was focusing the vast majority of his attention on Beleriand, thus the lands to the east became much more peaceful. By around this time, the Nandor seemingly withdrew to their shrinking forests, those of Lorenand and Greenwood, and the Vales of Anduin became home to a new people, men. These men were the ancestors of the Edain who were, like the elves before them, marching westwards, but only a fraction of the Edain actually reached Beleriand. Many of them ended up stopping somewhere amongst the vast lands east of the Blue Mountains. Those who came to dwell in the Vales of Anduin were men related to the Third House, the House of Marak, later the House of Hador. These men were often tall, with golden hair and fair skin, and they would be called the Northmen. By the time the First Age reached its end, these Northmen could be found dwelling all throughout Rhovanion, from the Vales of Anduin to the edge of the Sea of Rhûn, from the foothills of the Grey Mountains to the southern reaches of Greenwood. Although they were numerous, they were not a centralized people, instead dwelling in scattered villages and communities across the vast empty lands. We're not sure how much these men interacted with the Nandor who had remained in Greenwood and Lorenand, but we do know that they interacted heavily with the dwarves. The Longbeard dwarves who controlled the Misty Mountains from their capital at Khazad-dûm had already been stamping their mark on the Vales of Anduin. The men Ainalgrim, a road which ended up running from Khazad-dûm across the Anduin through Greenwood and to the distant colony in the Iron Hills, was already under construction. Thus, it did not take long for the dwarves to meet the Northmen and establish a friendly relationship, much to the relief of the Northmen, who had already encountered evil dwarves in the east. The Northmen and the Longbeards were mutually beneficial to each other. The Northmen knew little about metallurgy or construction. They did not craft with steel, nor did they construct with stone. Despite their valor, they were vulnerable to foes who were better armed than them, and their isolated settlements could be easily overcome. Thus, the dwarves taught them how to smith, and they constructed fortifications for them and built roads between their settlements. As for the dwarves, they hated practicing agriculture, whereas the Northmen, who had access to the wide, fertile lands around the Anduin, could sell plenty of food in exchange for dwarven labours. But it wasn't just trade where both sides benefited. The dwarves, despite their prowess in battle and their far superior weaponry, were always relatively few in number. The Northmen, however, were numerous and valiant, making up for the lack of dwarven manpower, and even more importantly, they tamed animals such as horses. This proved to be a major advantage in the beginning of the Second Age. Many of Morgoth's former servants fled east, and took up residence in the frozen wastes of Forodwaith. They would attempt to attack dwarven holdings or force their way through the Grey Mountains into the Vales of Anduin. Mounted Northmen could scout and harass the invaders, keeping a close watch on them until a company of heavily armed dwarves arrived to destroy them. Utilizing this strategy, the Vales of Anduin were kept safe, and the relationship between the dwarves and the Northmen, called the Alliance of Dwarves and Men, prospered for thousands of years. The early years of the Second Age also saw changes for the elves within the Vales of Anduin. Around the year 750 of the Second Age, groups of Sindar elves moved east and established new kingdoms, in both Greenwood and Lorenand. In Lorenand, an elf named Amdir was crowned king, and under him, and thanks to the influence of Galadriel, Lorenand would establish a close relationship with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the elves who dwelt in Eregion. However, in Greenwood, the newly crowned Orifer had different ideas, wishing for his elves to live a rustic, isolated lifestyle. Their contact with the outside world was more limited, and owing to both the rising threat of evil and the rising power of Khazad-dûm, he opted to withdraw his people further north through the forest. Nonetheless, at this point you have a highly populated, highly diverse, and more importantly, largely peaceful Vales of Anduin. In Khazad-dûm and on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains dwelt the dwarves, and their influence extended as far north as Gundabad. In the forest of Lorenand dwelt the Galathrim, ruled by King Amdir, and in the northern half of Greenwood was the Woodland Realm, ruled by King Orifer, and in all the wide lands in between were the numerous yet scattered communities of the Northmen. Unfortunately, the peace within the Vales of Anduin would come to an abrupt end. In 1693 of the Second Age, the War of the Elves and Sauron began. Although the primary theatre of the war was in Eriador, Rhovanion, and more specifically, the Vales of Anduin were not spared. Even as Sauron invaded Eriador, hordes of Easterlings that were allied to him flooded into Rhovanion, and the Northmen stood little chance against them. As for the dwarves, they earned Sauron's ire after attacking him in Eriador, and he commanded that his servants should attack them wherever and whenever they could. After the dwarven army retreated into Khazad-dûm, they shut their western gates and adopted a policy of defensive isolation, and they would send no help to the Northmen. This would do them little good. Shortly afterwards, they lost Gundabad to the orcs from the north, and the northern Misty Mountains became a battleground. By the time the smoke had cleared, the Northmen in the Vales of Anduin had been reduced to ruin. Those that survived and remained free had only managed by hiding in caves in the mountains or in the eaves of Greenwood. If they had any help from other peoples, it's never said, and like many other men in Middle-earth, they now had to endure the Dark Years, in which Sauron's power dominated the east, and an increasingly tyrannical Numenor dominated the coastlands. One saving grace for the Northmen was that Gil-galad's power in Eriador gradually recovered, and at some point the High King's influence crossed the Misty Mountains into Rhovanion. If any of Sauron's Easterling servants remained in the Vales of Anduin, they probably fled at this time. Gil-galad's power and the rise of the Númenórean realms in exile, Gondor and Arnor, allowed the Northmen in the Vales of Anduin to recover their strength, although there were still threats around, namely orcs in the Misty Mountains and in the Eaves of Greenwood, many of them sent there by Sauron to harass the Last Alliance as it passed through these lands. Speaking of the Last Alliance, it's never explicitly said that any of the Northmen joined them, but they were at least on friendly terms with them. The men in the Vales of Anduin did play a role in the aftermath of the war. In the second year of the Third Age, Isildur and a company of 200 knights were marching north, just to the east of the Gladden Fields, when they were attacked by orcs. Some woodsmen witnessed the attack and they sent runners to Thranduil of the Woodland Realm, who was dwelling at Emanduir at this point. Meanwhile, the woodmen gathered a company of their own warriors and rushed to the aid of the Númenóreans, but they were too late, only managing to save a single soldier. The orcs, having taken massive losses against the Númenóreans, were easily dispersed. Unknown to everyone, Isildur had been killed after swimming across Anduin, and the one ring that he had been carrying was lost in the river near to the Gladden Fields. By the early Third Age, the recovering Northmen had split into multiple groups. The most powerful groups were to the east of Greenwood, the men of Rhovanion and the future men of Dale, but they're beyond the scope of our tale. In the Vales of Anduin there were two groups of men, although I must say that these groups were possibly the same, as they seem to sometimes get used interchangeably by Tolkien. If there were differences, it would be in place of residence. The woodmen dwelt mostly in the eaves of Greenwood, whereas the men of the Vales of Anduin, the Vale men, dwelt mostly in the open, fertile valley between the Carrock and the north and down to the southern reaches of Greenwood. They would have spoken the same language, and were likely the same in terms of culture and organisation. During the early years of the Third Age, the Vales of Anduin were a peaceful place to live, which attracted a third group at some point, the Hobbits. We don't know where they came from, although we're told that they were around for a long time, and we also don't know where exactly they lived in the Vales of Anduin. The Stores, one of the groups of hobbits, later dwelt around the Gladden Fields, suggesting that hobbits may have also dwelt there at an earlier time. One thing we do know is that the hobbits did have some interactions with the Northmen who dwelt in the Vales, as the later Rohirrim knew of them as the Hobbitlan, and their languages shared some similar words. In the first millennium of the Third Age, the Vales of Anduin prospered under the protection of the might of Gondor. In fact, we're even told that the men of the Vales acknowledged the authority of Gondor during the days of King Harmendikil I, who ruled during the 12th century. What this actually means is unknown. Personally, I don't think it meant that the men of the Vales were forced to pay tribute. Instead, they probably had a similar relationship to Gondor as the men of Rhovanion. Basically, protect our northern frontier, and maybe occasionally they contributed some soldiers. Unfortunately, even as Gondor reached the height of its power, a new evil entered the lands adjacent to the Vales. In 1050 of the Third Age, the Necromancer took up residence on Amon Lanc in southern Greenwood. The hill would be renamed to Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery, and as the shadow fell on the forest, it would be renamed Mirkwood. This was a gradual process, and while the threat doesn't seem to have been existential to the Vales of Anduin at this time, it undoubtedly made the forest more dangerous. Nonetheless, the rise of Dol Guldur was enough to cause the Woodland Realm to retreat further north, beyond the Forest River, and for the hobbits to abandon their dwellings in the Vales of Anduin and cross the Misty Mountains, the Halfwoods in 1050, and the Fallowhides and the Stores around 100 years later. At least some of the Stores would return in 1356, thanks to the rise of Angmar, and they would become known as the Wilderland Hobbits, settling in the Gladden Fields. And speaking of the Witch Realm of Angmar, it arose in 1300, and while Angmar itself was largely situated to the west of the Misty Mountains, it was still a threat to the Vales of Anduin. This is because a small section of Angmar actually existed east of the Misty Mountains, in the very northern reaches of the Vales, around the rivers Greylin and Langwell. We have no idea whether this part of Angmar was militarily active, whether it was a colony of sorts, or whether the men of Angmar had always lived there. But they were not the only threat. The orcs began to increase in the Misty Mountains during this time, although the dwarves still held Khazad-dûm. Despite these new threats, the Vales of Anduin seem to have remained a largely peaceful place for the next few centuries, but events beyond the Vales would bring massive changes. The Great Plague struck in the 17th century, presumably also reaching the Vales, but perhaps not being as deadly as it was in other places, due to the lack of large interconnected communities in the region. However, the plague did severely weaken the Northmen of Rhovanion, and by the time of the Wainwrighter Easterling invasion of 1850, they had still not fully recovered. The Northman kingdom was destroyed. But not its people. While many remained behind and became enslaved by the Wainwriters, a group of Northmen led by a man named Marwinhi fled around southern Mirkwood and made new homes in the Vales of Anduin, between the Carrock and the Gladden Fields, mixing with the men there. They would be continuously joined by outlaws from Rhovanion, who fled through the narrows of Mirkwood. The Northmen, with the aid of Gondor, made an attempt to reclaim their homes in 1899, but despite the Wainwrighter army being defeated in battle, the attempt was unsuccessful. The survivors of Rhovanion would be obliged to make the Vales of Anduin their permanent homes, and they would become known as the Aethiod. The Aethiod would continue to aid Gondor during the final phase of the Wainwrighter War in 1944, and they would also contribute horsemen to Gondor's expeditionary force against Angmar in 1975. The destruction of Angmar presented an opportunity for the Aethiod. Although the Middle Vales of Anduin were fertile lands, they weren't exactly the flat, open plains, perfect for horses, that the Aethiod preferred. These lands were also already home to the Vale men, who were described as being quite numerous during those days, so the Aethiod didn't really have too much room, and the lengthening shadow of Dol Guldur, creeping ever northwards, was always in the back of everyone's minds. But the northern Vales of Anduin were different, flatter, wider, and the only men living there were those remnants of Angmar, the kingdom that the Aethiod had already helped destroy. Thus, the Aethiod, led by their lord, Frumgar, rode north, and in 1977 they dispersed the remnants of Angmar and took the northern Vales of Anduin for their own. At the confluence of the rivers Greylin and Langwell, they built their fortified capital of Framsburg, named for Fram, Frumgar's son, and later legendary dragon slayer. As for the Vale men, some of them may have accompanied the Aethiod to the north, but we do know that they continued to live as far south as the southern edge of Mirkwood during these days. There were some other fairly monumental changes in the region during this time, namely concerning Khazad-dûm and Lorinand. In 1980, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm awoke the Balrog and were forced to flee the following year, abandoning the city and the Misty Mountains. News of the terror reached Lorinand, causing many elves, including King Amroth, to leave the Woodland Kingdom. At this point, the kingdom was actually in danger of being abandoned, but it was stabilized when Galadriel and Celeborn arrived to take control. At this point, Lorinand would become known as Lothlorien. We're not told how these events affected the surrounding lands, but we do know that things would only improve in the Vales of Anduin in the centuries that followed. The destruction of Angmar weakened the orcs of the Misty Mountains, and Gandalf's journey to Dol Guldur in 2063 would cause Sauron, the Necromancer, to flee, beginning the nearly 400-year-long watchful peace. During these years, the Vale men, the Woodmen, and the Aethiod would all prosper and grow stronger, but as it turned out, this was merely the long calm before a powerful storm. In 2460, the Necromancer would return, and his forces would become active again across all of Middle-earth. But before we move on to the end of the Watchful Peace, we must talk about one of the most momentous events of the Third Age, that almost no one knew about at the time, the discovery of the One Ring, which occurred the very same year. As I said earlier, some of the stores had returned to the Vales of Anduin following the rise of Angmar, and 1,000 years later they still dwelt near to the Gladden Fields. While fishing, the store, Deagle, finds the One Ring, but is murdered by his cousin Smeagol, who was also present. Now, to be fair to Smeagol, it was his birthday, and store tradition allowed a birthday boy a free murder. Obviously, that is not true. Due to the methods in which he attained it, Smeagol was instantly corrupted by the One Ring. He used its power of invisibility to spy on his neighbours and learn their secrets or to steal, and he ended up becoming so immensely unpopular that he was banished from the village by his own grandmother. He would flee into the mountains where he would become more and more corrupted by the One Ring, eventually becoming the creature known as Golem. Ironically, he would outlast his village. Sometime between the year of his banishment and the War of the Ring, the Wilderland stores would just disappear. Whether they were destroyed or simply migrated, we just don't know. It wasn't just the returning threat at Dol Guldur that concerned the Northmen. In 2480, at the behest of Sauron, the Orcs of the Misty Mountains started making secret strongholds through the mountains, and they began to inhabit Moria, which had been abandoned by the dwarves for centuries at this point. The Orcs of the Misty Mountains would often raid down into the valley, attacking isolated settlements and either killing or enslaving their inhabitants. In response, the men who dwelt in the Vales made a great effort to arm themselves, which was enough to dissuade at least some of the Orcs. Funnily enough, another threat that the men of the Vales also faced were the Great Eagles, who sometimes raided the flocks and herds of men. But once the farmers and shepherds armed themselves with bows, the Eagles thought better of it. But the far greater threat, once again, came from the east. These were the Balkoff Easterlings, descendants of the Wainriders who had terrorized Gondor and the Northmen centuries earlier. The Balkoff were not as well armed or well organized as the Wainriders, but they had numbers. Their first victims were the few Northmen who had remained in Old Ravanian following the disintegration of the Wainriders, but afterwards they turned their attention to the Vales of Anduin, either attacking north from the Brownlands or passing through the forest itself. By 2509, their raids had become so devastating that the southern Vales of Anduin, anything south of the Gladden Fields, had become deserted. In 2510, the Balkoff were poised to invade Gondor through Carnevali, and Steward Kirion, recognizing the danger, decided to call upon Gondor's ancient allies, the Aethiod. 6 messengers were sent forth in 3 pairs, but the Balkoff exerted so much influence over the Vales by this point that 5 of them were killed during the journey. Only one, Barondir Udalrath, reached the Aethiod, who were led by Eorl the Young. After some deliberation, Eorl decided that he would ride to Gondor's aid, saying that if Gondor fell, nowhere would be safe. Eorl led an army of 7,000 horsemen, as well as several hundred mounted archers, south through the Vales of Anduin, and thanks to the friendly sorcery of Galadriel, which countered the dark sorcery spilling out from Dol Guldur, they arrived just in time to save Gondor's army at the Battle of the Field of Celebrant. The Balkoff, as well as an army of orcs from the mountains, were utterly destroyed. As a reward, Kirion gave Eorl the largely depopulated land of Carnevali. Eorl graciously accepted. The wide, open plains were perfect for the Aethiod, who in the years of peace that had just passed, had grown so much in numbers that the comparatively narrow lands of the northern Vales of Anduin were becoming less and less capable of supporting them. Over the next few years, the Aethiod would migrate to this new land, which would eventually be called Rohan. We're not told whether any of the Aethiod remained behind, but any reference to the Vales of Anduin afterwards suggested that everything just to the north of the Carrock was deserted, and the fortified town of Framsburg probably fell into ruin. With the abandonment of the southern Vales of Anduin and the migration of the Aethiod to Rohan, the inhabited section of the Vales of Anduin was now only between the Gladden Fields and the Carrock. But even this stretch of land was not secure. Orc raids from the Misty Mountains seemed to have rendered the land north of the Old Forest Road uninhabited, and the woodmen seemed to have retreated entirely to the eaves of the forest, which was not exactly safe either. That said, the Vales of Anduin got some relief following the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, which ended in 2799, and saw the Orcs of the Misty Mountains almost entirely wiped out. We're not sure if men played any part in the war, though one could reasonably assume that they provided some aid to the dwarves. In the years that followed, we're aware of two new groups, or rather, one group and one individual, or perhaps even just two individuals, that were in the Vales of Anduin. The individual was Radagast the Brown, one of the 5 wizards, who at the time of The Hobbit, set in 2941, is said to have been dwelling at a place called Rhosgobel. Rhosgobel's exact location isn't known, except that it was in the western eaves of Mirkwood, probably not far from the Gladden Fields. We actually don't know how long Radagast was dwelling there for. Realistically, given Radagast arrived to Middle-earth around the year 1000, he may have been living there for well over 1,000 years by this point. The group were the Beornings. The origins of the Beornings, or what exactly they were, is unclear. They were men related to the Northmen, and they seem to have lived in the Misty Mountains before being driven out by the Orcs. They were most notable for their ability to skin change, or shapeshift, into the form of large bears. Who or what a Beorning is unclear, because we're not sure if the Beornings were a distinct group of people who entered the Vales at some point, of which Beorn was a prominent member of, or whether the Beornings were specifically only those men who were descended from Beorn, or later took him as their chieftain. Some of the Beornings are also described as being bad, but this may refer to them as acting more like outlaws rather than genuinely serving the dark. Around the time of The Hobbit, the tide was finally turning in the favour of the Vales of Anduin once again. Beorn had his dwelling near to the Carrock, and he did a fairly decent job of keeping the surrounding lands clear, stalking the lands in the form of a massive bear. Meanwhile, because the Orcs of the Misty Mountains were still in the long process of recovery, the braver woodmen and valemen who had been driven south were gradually recovering lost territory up towards the Carrock, cutting down trees and building new settlements in the woods or near to the waters of the Anduin. In 2941, we actually learned that the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, allied with the local wargs, were planning on launching a massive raid into the Vales in order to undo the progress of the Northmen, but they were soon distracted by the situation that was unfolding at Erebor. Bolg, the Orc chieftain of Gundabad, led a large army of Orcs to the Lonely Mountain, where they were almost totally annihilated at the Battle of the Five Armies. This constituted 3/4 of the fighting force of the Orcs of the North. In the space of 150 years, the Orcs of the Misty Mountains had sustained 2 enormous defeats, rendering them largely irrelevant just as evil was growing in power across the rest of Middle-earth. For a brief period, only 10 years, Dol Guldur was also left deserted thanks to the preemptive strike by the White Council. Beorn, who took part in the battle and killed Bolg, was then made chief by many of the surrounding woodmen, creating something of a centralized community and fighting force in the Vales of Anduin. Those living in the Vales could travel without fear for the first time in many years. We're told that under Beorn and later his son Grimbeorn, the Beornings would keep open the mountain passes, but would charge a hefty toll to travellers. Gimli and Glóin pay this toll when travelling to Rivendell. But the fear of the Orcs was replaced by a new fear, of a ghost that drank blood and allegedly even broke into houses to steal babies, presumably eating them. This was Gollum, who after spending 5 centuries in the caves of the Misty Mountains, was finally drawn forth by his loss of the One Ring. Unsure of where the Shire was or how to find Baggins, he did spend at least several years wandering around Wyther Rhovanion, leaving a trail of depravity until eventually, evil summoned him to Mordor. Several decades later, Gollum would pass through the Vales of Anduin once again, this time as Aragorn's prisoner, and the Beornings would help the two of them cross the Anduin on their way to the Woodland Realm. By the time of the War of the Ring, the conflict had once again arisen in the Vales of Anduin. The Beornings, still led by Grimbeorn, now known as the Old, kept places such as the High Pass open, but the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, while still far from their peak, had recovered enough to pose a reasonable threat once again. After the Ringbearer reached Rivendell, scouts were sent out across the nearby lands, including those to the other side of the Misty Mountains. In the end, the High Pass was removed as an option for the Fellowship. not just because of the winter conditions, but because travelling down the eastern side of the Misty Mountains would be too dangerous due to the orcish presence there. Unfortunately, we received little information about the conflict that followed. Our only glimpse is from Frodo when he's atop Amon Hen. Looking northwards, he can see hosts of orcs pouring from the Misty Mountains like ants. He can see that the lands of the Beornings are aflame, and he can see both men and elves battling fell beasts under the trees of Mirkwood. This tells us that the orcs of the Misty Mountains had answered Sauron's call and were attacking the Beornings who lived in the Vales. Their raids must have had some successes, given that the lands were described as aflame. Meanwhile, the woodmen, as they always had, were battling Sauron's creatures alongside the elves in Mirkwood. But as they had done many times in the past, those who dwelt in the Vales of Anduin survived the war. Dol Guldur emptied its power to no avail, and after the fall of Sauron, the elves of Lothlorien crossed to Anduin and destroyed the fortress. Thranduil and Celeborn met amidst the trees and proceeded to partition the forest, renaming it Erin Lascallan, the Wood of Green Leaves. Thranduil took the northern section of the forest, Celeborn took the southern section, which was renamed East Lorien. However, central Erin Lascallan, between the Old Forest Road and the Narrows of the Forest, was given to the Beornings and the Woodmen. We're also told that men who dwelt on the eaves of Mirkwood, so probably the Woodmen and or the Beornings, sent a delegation to Gondor following the crowning of King Elessar. Come the Fourth Age, I think the future would have looked bright for the Vales. The land would have come under the protective umbrella of the reunited kingdom, Dol Guldur had been destroyed, and the orcs of the Misty Mountains would have only continued to weaken and dwindle away without a Dark Lord to guide them. There would have been a lot of good, empty land to resettle, and there would have been plenty of trade and travellers, passing from east to west or west to east, particularly dwarves. Perhaps those who dwelt in the Vales would continue to live the existence they always had, or perhaps they would take a step further, not just recognising a descendant of Beorn as a chieftain, but perhaps even as a king. Either way, as it was from the very start, recognised by the very earliest elves, I think the Vales would have been a pleasant place to live. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you want to know more about the Beornings or the Aethiod, you can watch my videos on them. If you want to experience the Vales of Anduin, they're often a playable faction in many mods, and they've been almost entirely covered by the Lord of the Rings Online. If you have any suggestions for other podcast videos, please let me know. But until then, cheers, farewell, and remember, whenever I played the Vales of Anduin in Divide and Conquer, they were actually the Fails of Anduin.